Okay, welcome back everybody to On the Ball, the video podcast series from the Vanderbilt Sports and Society Initiative. I'm Andrew Maraniss, and I'm really excited to have Bernard Nomberg with us today as our guest. Bernard, a former Vanderbilt quarterback, class of 1990, from Dothan, Alabama, now an attorney in Birmingham. And Bernard, I would say that you're probably the best example of someone who's intentional about maintaining and creating friendships and building communities of former student athletes. And we have a lot of that to talk about, but just wanted to mention that right off the top. And thank you for joining the show today.
My friend Andrew, thank you for having me on today. I'm honored considering the guests who've been on in the past, some very fine dignitaries and former student athletes at Vanderbilt and well-known authors and video movie producers, et cetera. But thank you for having me on. I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like I'm interviewing the interviewer today with the great series you have, Conversations with Commodores, where you interview former Vanderbilt football players from multiple generations, collecting these stories. I know you do a similar thing with your high school, where you were a state champion quarterback in Alabama. And then you also, I didn't realize you also had a series where you're, hiking and have messages for folks. On the Trail is the name of that one. So you're all over the place, multimedia mogul, Bernard.
Andrew, it just shows that I just have a lot of hot air. I got to get it out.
That's right. So you are an attorney. I know your father was as well. So before we catch up to what you're doing now, could you fill us in a little bit on your childhood in Dothan and the people you had around you,
Sure.
The example that your dad set for you?
Dad was an attorney for more than 50 years in our hometown in Dothan, which is in the southeast corner of the state, near Tallahassee, Panama City, the Florida Panhandle. And my brothers and I just grew up going to Dad's office, and it made such an impression on me. He did similar work that my brother David and I, who's my business partner, that we do now in Birmingham. So Dad was really our inspiration because he showed what a difference he could make in a positive way for individuals who were in some of their most stressful times, particularly individuals who were hurt on the job. And all of life's stressors ramp up when your health is impacted because you can't earn, you can't provide, et cetera. And what he was able to do, he couldn't fix every problem and he couldn't make everything perfect, but he improved the lives of so many people. And growing up in his firm, it made such a huge impression on me that that's what I knew I wanted to do for my profession. So I've been doing that now in Birmingham for 28 years. And it's hard to believe it's already been 28 years. But that's what David and I and some other lawyers in our firm, that's what we do.
Incredible. So you knew from an early age this is what you wanted to do. And I read an interesting article about you that talked about the different ways that folks in rural Alabama sometimes compensated your dad for his work.
They certainly did. It would not be a shock to see a refrigerated truck, literally with a refrigerator on the back of the truck, to come by to pay Dad steaks, hot hamburgers and beef and pizzas and chickens. It didn't happen all the time. Dothan wasn't that rural, but Dad did have a few clients who were either farmers or food distribution business owners. And sometimes they would come by, and man, that was when you're a 12-year-old boy and you see the fridge, you just getting loaded up in the freezer. That's a big day. Those were some fun times.
Obviously, football being king in Alabama. Growing up, were you an Alabama family, Auburn family, neither?
Oh, now the second school you just mentioned was a bad term in our house. Everybody, until me, just about everybody in the family was an Alabama grad, including my brothers. Both went there. My uncle played for Bama in the 60s. Mom and Dad both went there. So yes, we grew up as Alabama fans, even though Auburn was only about 2 hours north of our hometown. Bama was the place that that's where we went. That's where
And were you a football player from the beginning, or multi-sport athlete? What was your interest as a kid?
Growing up in the 70s in South, you played the season, the sport of the season. I played basketball, football, and baseball. Baseball was and still is my first love. I retired, if you will, from basketball when it was very clear that that was not my main sport. but baseball and football really had my attention all through high school. And then thankfully or luckily, when Watson Brown was hired on at Vanderbilt in the fall of '85, my luck of the draw, the lightning in a bottle, if you will, that we captured during our playoffs my senior year made its way to Watson's desk, and he ended up offering me a scholarship that winter, and that's how I ended up at Vanderbilt.
Okay, and what were the factors that went into that decision? I know that's something you discuss when you interview former players, student athletes from Vanderbilt. Is of the choices they had, what was appealing to them about Vanderbilt? I know Watson Brown had a reputation as a real offensive wizard at that time. Vanderbilt's academics, I'm sure, played into it. But what were the different factors that mattered to you, and what did it come down to in the end?
Well, it was I had an academics full scholarship to go to Alabama and potentially walk on. And honest to goodness, I looked at Alabama's defensive roster for the fall of '86, and I did not want to be the scout team quarterback for 4 years doing that. I had hoped to maybe play baseball in college, and that was discussed a little bit with Watson. I had some interest from some other schools for baseball, but when you looked at everything, it just didn't make sense to not sign with Vanderbilt and the academic reputation, to get to play in the SEC, the city of Nashville, which back then was not the city that it is now, of course, but there were just so many positives. And then we went and visited the school, and it just blew me away. And I just knew that's where home was going to be for 4 years.
No, that's great. And you come in as a quarterback at a time when one of the only Heisman candidates in Vanderbilt history is also a quarterback at Vandy. So you're around people like Eric Jones and John Gromos, I guess Marcus Wilson towards the end of your career. What was that like, being part of a really talented group of quarterbacks with such an offensive-minded coach?
I tried to be a sponge every day. I knew I was not the most athletic. I knew I wasn't the smartest, and I've later learned in life, surrounding yourself with those who are the smartest, the brightest, the most athletic, and learning from them it was such a treat for me. Rick Christophel, who later went on to coach with the Patriots and the pros, he was the tight ends coach during their Super Bowl run with Brady. He was one of our quarterbacks coach. So with Coach Christophel and with Coach Brown, to be able to sit in the room with Mark Ratcher, John Gromos, Tim Richardson, et cetera, it was, I didn't fully appreciate it then, but later in life, I realized, man, that was such a special room. But you're right. Eric Jones just had all of those intangibles, and he had that Heisman campaign. I think it was in the fall of '88. He had such a special season, but yeah, it was pretty cool to be in that room during those times.
I bet. So fall of '88 was my freshman year. That was the first Vanderbilt football. I didn't grow up here, so those were my first memories of Vandy football. I remember Boo Mitchell making the L, with his arms when he caught passes from Eric Jones. And I remember the big upset of Florida when you guys wore the gold uniforms in that game. What were from the on the field standpoint, the biggest games, or your favorite memories, highlights from the victories in those days?
Well, there's a few. We didn't win a ton of games, but those experiences have lasted a lifetime. And that's a lot of what I get into in my series of conversations with Commodores, just learning from others' experiences as well. But we got to go play at West Point. We lost the game late. It started snowing, but just the appreciation of seeing the cadets march through campus and appreciating where we were, seeing the mouth of the Hudson River and where it bends at the campus that's a memory I'll always have. We played Maryland at home, and I think it was Dan Henning was the coach, and his son, I think, was the quarterback. I hope I have the names right. But there's a series, and you've probably seen this video. The quarterback throws an out route, he overthrows his receiver, and it just happens to come to me. I catch it, big deal. I give it to the ref, no big deal. They reset the next play. The exact same thing occurs in that the quarterback overthrows his receiver again. I'm about to catch it, and our coach, Watson Brown, dives in front of me on the sideline, catches the ball, spikes it, I think, and says to me something along the lines, "You're not going to show me up in front of our hometown crowd." And the crowd goes nuts. Who's ever seen a head coach in a Power Five, well, back then wasn't called that, but in an SEC program, do that. I mean, it was awesome. And that's something I still get chuckled about and have good times talking with others who are on the sidelines that actually occurred. And we have video of it.
Hilarious. And then I know from a really sad and poignant episode, I was down in Oxford, Mississippi when Chucky Mullins was injured in that game. You were standing on the sidelines. What do you remember about that day?
Well, that was that event. I appreciate you bringing that up because that was going to be my third reference. It wasn't a great memory at all, but it's certainly a vivid memory. That year, that was in the fall of '89. I think it was Ole Miss's homecoming, beautiful day. First quarter, we drive down, and John Gromos throws a pass to Brad Gaines. Simple, just a stop route, turns around and catch a hot route and catches it, but it's a little high. He jumps up, and apparently, it's obvious now, Chucky took a bad angle on the hit. It's nothing Brad did, nothing John did. It was just a bad angle by Chucky, and that produced such a terrible injury for him. Well, that was on third down. Well, fourth down, I held for extra points and field goals that year, so we run out. At the time, we didn't appreciate what was going on with Chucky just yards away from us. But by the time we got out there, we realized that it was much more serious than initially had thought. Never been in a situation like that. I'm sure most haven't. Game stopped for about 45 minutes. I remember the ambulance coming on the field. I remember it being incredibly quiet. But then what unfolded over the weeks and months and few years after that, it's been well told by many others, but it certainly has left an impression on myself and those of us who were part of the Vanderbilt football team at that time and who were there that day. I know that many others have spoken about that. Brad Bates certainly has spoken about that. Excuse me, Brad Gaines, not Brad Bates. Brad Bates was our strength and conditioning coach then. But yes, that was just one of those events that it's just a memory that'll always be with me.
Yeah, I remember it would be interesting to see what the reaction would be in today's social media age to something like that. But at the time, you know, I assume the game was televised, but I don't know if it was for sure. But it did seem to have such an impact. I remember coming back to campus and there was a large like get well card on the wall that students could sign and was sent to the hospital where Chucky was. And then just to see the way that Brad has maintained that vigil of visiting his grave at Christmas every year. And I think another time each year, 2 times a year.
Yeah.
It's a real lasting impact, not only on Gaines and the Ole Miss family, but, you know, everybody that was there in that stadium that day.
One of the beautiful things, two things that I remember, Andrew, that there was fundraising around the SEC that rest of that season. And I want to say more than $1 million may have been raised. I could be off on my figures. But the other thing is the way that the Ole Miss community, the football community, Coach Brewer, welcomed Brad into the fold and just made him, I think, I can't speak for Brad, but what I can tell is they brought him in as one of their own and treated him like he was one of their brothers.
Yeah, it certainly feels that way. And like you said, all he did was catch a pass, but I you know, some feeling of guilt there, it seems, but he certainly didn't do anything wrong. So when you were a student athlete at Vandy, how did you balance all that you had on your plate, you know, as an athlete and as a student, you know, with someone that had law school in mind? So obviously you're taking your academics seriously. It's something I really admire about the student athletes here is, you know, how high they have to perform in all areas of their life. And it's not always easy. I know there's more support for them than there was back in your day. So how did you do it?
Well, it wasn't that easy. I don't want to speak ill of my high school upbringing, but I went to a public city school, and I thought it had prepared me okay. But by the time I got to Vanderbilt, I came in a semester early not a semester early, but that summer I came in to take a class to just get used to college life, to start working out. And it did not take very long to realize that I wasn't in high school anymore. And I was glad I took that class. It was a history class, and I ended up majoring in history and still love it to read it and to be.
That was a history major too.
And that's a whole side topic you and I could talk about another time.
Yeah.
But I'm glad I was redshirted my freshman year, because it's a lot of athletes don't like that. They want to get and play their sport immediately. But I was one of those who needed time to get stronger, faster, learn the offense, get acclimated to college life. And so not traveling to the away games and not having all the expectations on me that the active squad, if you will, had, it did allow me to get acclimated, to get more organized, because that freshman year, that was a rough transition for me, academically, socially, and athletically. And I'm glad that I had it. But I'm so glad now that the Ingram Center for Student Success and the other programs that are in place for the Vanderbilt student athletes are there. We didn't have all of those things. We had tutors, we had access to tutors, but not the programs and the different organizations that are in place for the student athletes. I'm so pleased those are all in place.
Mhm.
I would have loved to have had access to that back in the 80s.
Right. Real quick, how many interviews have you done for Conversations with Commodores?
I think tonight will be about 164, 165 over the last 4 years.
All right, unbelievable. And I know the vast, 95% of those are former players. Then you've got some scrubs like me that you've talked to as well. But I mean, so you're someone that has kept in touch with so many former student athletes at Vandy, football players, whether they were teammates of yours or from other eras. But back when you were on the team, were you that type? You know, like, were you somebody that was friends with everybody, that was like the convener? Or how did you develop that aspect of your relationship with Vanderbilt football?
Something happened later in life, because I was kind of a fade into the background kind of a guy. I had my group of friends on the team. I had my group of friends who were not athletes, but either history majors, or we just had other things in common. But I think I developed this later in life. Maybe it was part of my just learning how to market myself for our law firm, because we're a very small firm, and we're not on, you won't see us on billboards or TV, none of those things, but we do a lot on social media. And just, I'd love to tell you, Andrew, that when the pandemic hit, a light bulb went off in my head. Let's form this Facebook group for Vanderbilt football and let's do these interviews. It was about 6 months before that I just, with my high school program, my high school closed down and it merged into our rival high school in my hometown in Dothan. And a lot of former Northview High School athletes and graduates were very upset about what happened, but it was out of our control. It was just the dynamics of the city had changed, the demographics had changed, and those decision makers decided to consolidate the two schools. Well, my high school head coach, who started our program in the late 70s, was very vocal and upset as well. And I had already been doing my weekly show for my law firm about interviewing different people about different things. So I started this Facebook group for my high school. The following month, in the fall of 19, I started it for Vanderbilt. And then I just started doing these interviews. And I don't like to call them interviews, I call them conversations. But it was a way of sharing through the oral history of my high school's football program and then Vanderbilt's football program. So I've been doing these for about 4 years or so, but it just kind of organically came about that way. And then now the last 4 years, I've just been in touch with so many Vanderbilt alums, football predominantly, that it just keeps morphing and keeps growing. And I love it. I love connecting with Commodores who played in the 50s all the way up to Commodores who are on the current team. I had Ethan Barr on the program earlier this year. So it's just something that's a momentum that has just been building over the last few years.
That's tremendous. This is a sensitive subject. I mean, I know that your wife passed away in 2007 as well, and you have two beautiful daughters. And I just wondered if there was an aspect to this that is about maintaining relationships, forging relationships, just being with people, that in any way was tied to that event in your life. And just sort of, I know one big thing you really do is look out for people whose stories haven't been told. It just seems like there's a poignant aspect to this beyond just, marketing your firm. And and giving people a chance to talk about their glory days on the gridiron. But it's such a human thing of hearing stories and valuing these relationships while you can.
I'll give you credit, Andrew, because you're the first person who has expressed that back to me, but that's always been there. Karen, my late wife, as you said, did pass away from her fight with breast cancer in 07. And my daughters our daughters were 8 and 10 at the time. And one of her core values was giving back to the community, volunteering, philanthropy, whatever it is that she had in her person. She felt it was one of her life's missions to give back. And there is a famous Judaic saying from the Pirkei Avot, from the Talmud, that says basically, and I'm going to paraphrase, it's not your responsibility to complete the task, nor are you permitted to stop performing the task. Is basically what it means. Is that's an obligation. If you undertake it, you continue with it through your life. Mm-hmm. And taking Karen's lead on that, we developed those values with our daughters. And my daughters, Sydney and Emily, who are both now in their 20s and on their careers and doing their thing, that's something that's just been part of us ever since. And it's part of Karen's legacy. And I appreciate you mentioning her and bringing that up. But yes, that's exactly where this comes from, is just bringing community together and just sharing times, good or bad. But you're right, giving individuals this platform to share their stories, whether they're great stories or painful. Mm-hmm. This is their opportunity, and it's given in a safe space within the Vanderbilt community in a closed private Facebook group. And some people get very emotional. You know, I'm not Roy Firestone. Remember him from the 80s? Don't make me cry, Roy.
Right.
But when you're thinking about simpler times in your life, when you're a teenager or becoming in your 20s, life's a little more simple than it is when you become an adult. And sometimes those memories create some emotions. And I don't do it to embarrass anybody. I do it to share their stories, to give them the platform, because a lot of stories need to be told, and they haven't yet. And that's why I keep doing this.
Well, I'm glad we had a chance to talk about your wife and her influence that continues today through your series. And when you talk to folks, whether they played in the 50s or 60s or today, do they seem to remember most what happened on the field, or the funny episodes that happened in the locker room, you know, or the friendships they built off the field? Is it all of the above, or like what are the common threads of what the folks, you know, really remember the most and want to share?
It's always a great thing for me to delve into with each of the guests who are on the show. Some have explicit and vivid memories of things that happened 40, 50 years ago. Others, whether through life's traumas or traumas of playing sports, don't have the memory capacity that they wish they did. And it's always interesting to see how that unfolds during a conversation. But what is common, whether they played in the 50s or 60s or the 2020s, is we're all Commodores. We're all wore the black and gold, and we all have a lot of common memories, regardless of when you played, whether it's Palmer Fieldhouse that's no longer there, or McGugin, which soon will not be in its current state in a few years, playing in the stadium, practicing behind. And those things are common to everybody who's played. What's different is maybe the individuals who you played with and played against. But the wins and losses and the memorable plays sometimes fade in the background. What's more important to most people is how they connected back then and still connect with their teammates. And when I ask most folks, what's your best memory or your most vivid memory? It's cutting up in the locker room. It's being in the huddle with your brothers. It's getting in trouble at Jonesy's. It's going to whatever class that you don't want to at 8 o'clock. It's the trips. It's being together. And as I shared with you, we had the recent game at UNLV in Vegas earlier this season. And I got to sit down with a couple of teammates and trainer and coach and strength coach, and just sitting there reliving and hearing stories that I knew or participated in or had never heard before. That was good for the soul, Andrew. It just, as I told you, I was laughing so hard I snorted one time because it just takes you back. And that's what most guests, that's what gets them jazzed up, is sharing some of those core memories from back then. And frankly, a lot of them are still in a text thread or may call one of them, and all they have to do is say one word or one phrase, and it takes them right back there. And that's the best part of these conversations.
Absolutely. Before we started this, I was on a text thread with, this is my second time working in the athletic department. First was my first job out of school, and I was texting with some guys that I knew back then, and we may have only worked together for 2 years, but that time of your life is so important in developing these lifelong friendships. And we were just talking about an episode that was not significant, but it just busted us all up just remembering what happened. What do you notice in differences, like in just how good the team was on the field? And specifically, like, I've talked to people over the years who maybe don't go back to their high school reunion because they've become a different person than they were back in high school. They don't want to be taken back to that feeling, or maybe they didn't have a good experience as a student at Vanderbilt and they don't come back to reunions here. For guys that played on teams that either maybe they didn't fulfill their personal goals as a player or the team didn't perform well, have you ever interviewed someone that was a little reluctant to do it and then seen them open up, and it be this benefit that maybe they didn't even expect?
Many. And I'll give you kind of some themes without naming names. I'll just kind of tell you what my observations have been. And this doesn't go for everybody, but those who went to school at Vanderbilt and stayed in the Vanderbilt football bubble, who didn't allow themselves to make friendships or networking outside of the football, outside of Magoogan, and then graduated or completed their eligibility and went on to whatever it is in life, a lot of those individuals did not have the positive experience that others who may have taken advantage of networking, taking advantage of friendships and other things outside of football. And again, not everybody fits into one or the other category. It's just an overarching themes that I have seen. I think a lot of it also depends on how society treated people depending on when you were in school. Going to school at Vanderbilt, I can only imagine in the 50s, 60s, 70s was a lot different than going to school in the 2000s, particularly for minority athletes, minority student athletes, regardless of your background. The world did not treat minorities nearly as well as maybe they do now, and some say still not good enough. But I think that that's probably the two biggest factors that I've seen, Andrew, with these conversations. Then, regardless of skin color, origin, where you're from, or anything, how has the university treated you after you left is another indicative of how people think these days about their experiences. I can only speak for myself personally. When I finished and graduated in 4 years, I didn't want to take a fifth year that I had. I knew it was time to move on. I knew it was time to retire, if you will, from sports and go to law school and all of that. There were several years afterward that I just didn't care for the sport of football anymore. I did not go back to Vanderbilt. I wasn't mad at Vanderbilt. I just was kind of done with that. But then slowly, with friends on the team going back to reunions or maybe wanting to meet up at ball games, I kind of got back into the spirit of that. And over the last, say, 10 to 15 years, I've been all in on it. And I try to go to as many games as I can, be as involved. But not everybody has that experience. Some have never come back, like you mentioned, because they have their own issues with whatever their experience was. And then you have others who are all in, and you see them at every game, everything. They are what you'd hope everyone might be to support the school. So it really is all over the board, but there are many common factors that impact those decisions on how they treat their experiences then and still.
One thing I wanted to ask you was from the interviews you've done, what are the lessons to be learned for an athletic department today to make sure that student athletes have a positive experience at the time and later? And two things you mentioned, one is, opportunities to get out of the bubble, to get out of McGugin, to make friends and contacts and be involved in campus life, which I know is a priority of Candace Lee, the athletic director, and the student athlete success program you mentioned. Second thing being, how has the university treated you since you left? And, one new initiative, relatively new to become better at that, is the Black and Gold Club, Letterman's Club here at Vanderbilt. Are there other lessons that you've picked up, big or small, that would be wise for people associated with the department or just as alums, and ways they can support the student athletes here that you've picked up on?
With our school being a private and smaller population and alums, it's hard to compare with the big state schools and what they've done over the decades as treating their sports alums. But I think it's human nature that you see that your buddies who went to Alabama, Auburn, wherever they went, and how their schools have created these different programs and platforms for them. And I think that the athletics department under Candace and others have seen a lot of those things. They've heard a lot of what alums are saying, and they're putting those things into place. So I applaud all of those efforts. The Black and Gold Club, I think, is growing, and because it's for all sports alums. And I know that there's a liaison for every sport. Alfonso Harvey happens to be ours, and he does a fabulous job. So those programs that are in place just need to continue to grow. They need to continue to reach out to as many sports alums. And I know we're really kind of talking about football here, but they need to reach out to as many former student athletes as they can. And I'll give you a quick example of a former guest who was on the show. He was a walk-on during my time period. He only played for 2 years, but he also was in fraternity. And he speaks so highly of that experience. But I'm not sure he's ever been reached or contacted by the athletics department. He's very successful in business. I think he has a lot of great energy. He lives on the West Coast. And I think he'd be an awesome person to make contact with, and even to speak to the team.
Mm-hmm.
But I also know that there's limits on how many people are employed with the school. I get that. It's growing pains, but they're good growing pains. And I don't know if I'm specifically answering what you asked, but from my observations, they just need to keep growing all of these programs and reaching as many people as they can. I really think that's the momentum. People are seeing all the construction that's going on. And I think that too has got the momentum going. I think it's a great time. And I've said this many times, Andrew, and just stop me now because I'm kind of adding on to this. If I'm a 10th, 11th grade student athlete, and I want to come to Vanderbilt, or I want that Vanderbilt to be on my radar, and I see what's going on with the athletics facilities, gosh, that would get me fired up. That would so get me fired up.
Walking into this building every day, past all the construction, that gets me fired up. I can't wait to see it when it's done. But back to your previous comments about reaching out, listening to stories, expressing an interest in hearing those stories from different generations of alums. And you mentioned that experience here could be affected by things such as race, and I know that one of the recent interviews you did was with the pioneers of Vanderbilt football, which is in some ways almost an official group. In other ways, it's a loose definition. But as far as the athletic department is concerned in the football program, the pioneers are considered the first decade of Black players on the varsity football team at Vandy, which would essentially cover the very late 60s through the whole 1970s. And they've had reunions on campus, brunch, Candace meets with representatives of the pioneers several times a year just to plan events and to hear their stories of the current members of the team. had a chance to meet with them at their reunion 2 years ago. They were on the field at the Alabama A&M game this year. James Threlkill, who is a fantastic artist, who is one of those pioneers, has created an amazing painting depicting all of those men, which hangs here in McGugin. But what a special interview that you had with some representatives of that pioneer group. And I would recommend that, folks who are part of your Facebook group, check it out. Former players who are watching this who aren't yet a part of the group can join. But what were some of the takeaways you took from your discussion with some of these men who were maybe they weren't the very first? And that's one of the pieces of feedback that we got, is that the university has done a good job of recognizing Perry Wallace, for example, in men's basketball. And of course, he was the first Black varsity student athlete in the SEC that played a whole 4-year career in any sport. But that doesn't mean that the experience was all that different for number 2 and number 3 and number 20 and number 50, that came along over those next 10 years. What did you take away from that conversation?
Andrew, my first goal was to get out of their way. My second goal was to provide a platform where they would feel like it was okay to share their stories. And the men who were on, the pioneers, were Taylor Stokes, who was the first African-American scholarship football player for Vanderbilt in the fall of '69. Walter Overton, who technically, even though Holloway in Tennessee is recognized as the first SEC quarterback, Walter suited up as a freshman quarterback for Vanderbilt the year before. So we'll give recognition to Walter. Doug Nettles was the first African-American drafted into the NFL from Vanderbilt. Followed a few years later, at the end of the decade, we had Wayman Buggs, who led the entire world in receptions 2 years. And we also had Marshall Cheatham, who came down from Chicago and just was a great contributor in the late '70s. So those 5 men were the first ones I had on the round table. And when they started sharing stories, it was incredible, because you and I would never have these experiences. And I don't want to spoil their stories, but I'll share 2 quick ones. Doug Nettles tells about having a shotgun pulled on him in 1971 in Tuscaloosa outside the stadium, he and Walter Overton. And just to hear Doug tell that story is shocking in and of itself. But he also tells about going to Ole Miss. And at the end of the game, they had already changed, they're walking to the buses. A gentleman who is part of the cleanup crew for the stadium says to Walter and Doug, "Thank you." It was an African-American man.
Mm-hmm.
And Doug, the way he tells the story, and Walter as well, at first they didn't understand what the thank you meant. But then it dawned on them. And frankly, both men had considered leaving Vanderbilt up to that point because of many reasons. And the way Doug and Walter tell the story, it really pivoted their thinking, and it was one of the main reasons why they ended up staying. So just to hear, that's just 2 very quick stories that I think are so vitally important to be shared. And that's why I gave the platform, and I continue to give this platform. And I'm doing round 2 Pioneers Roundtable in early January. And I hope to have 5 or 6 other pioneers to share their stories. I think it's incredibly important to hear them.
When I hear you talk, even your voice, it reminds me a little bit of Bill Curry, who's somebody I really admire in sports, former Alabama coach. And he told me, I interviewed him for an article for ESPN, and he said that growing up in Atlanta, the first Black people that he was ever really around on an equal basis was in the Green Bay Packers. And he said that he learned that everybody's sweat smells the same, in the locker room, right? And that had a profound impact on him and changed the direction of his life. And he's, very committed to racial justice these days. How did playing sports, whether in, Southeastern Alabama or in high school or at Vanderbilt, and just being in the locker room with people from diverse backgrounds, how did that shape who you became?
Well, you're right. Growing up in Dothan in the '70s, in a Jewish family, you certainly weren't part of the majority from that standpoint, from a religious standpoint. But I was blessed with a little bit of athletic ability as a kid and played on sports teams that were probably about 50-50 whites and blacks. And frankly, I think frankly, sport itself overtook any racial issues that I ever experienced in my life, whether it was a black-white issue or a religious issue. I never really experienced a lot of turmoil from that standpoint. I was certainly welcomed into my teammates' homes all over the city, just like we hosted countless teammates. Gosh, my childhood home, Andrew's, in the same neighborhood as where our high school's baseball park was located, less than a mile away. And I cannot tell you how many hundreds, if not thousands, of sandwiches my mom, we prepared like in an assembly line, because there'd be 10 or 12 teammates, and I could care less who was there. These were my buddies. These were my teammates, white or black. And particularly, man, if you could play, you were starting, you were playing. But just those core childhood memories and about how my grandparents and parents treated all people certainly made an impact. Now, when I got to Vanderbilt, you go from my high school experience of about 60-40 white-black student population, city of Dothan. You go to Vanderbilt, the majority of the students, the non-athletes, of course, at that time were white, but not on the sports teams. Most of the sports teams were fully, well, of course, they were fully integrated, but the percentages, again, were, I don't remember what they were, but none of those things ever mattered. It's like what you just said about Bill Curry's comment. Everybody's sweat smells the same. It all is smelly. I don't care what your background is. But if you're my teammate, man, you're my teammate and you're my brother. And that's what I love about sports, at least from my experiences. Not everybody's the same, don't get me wrong, but that was my experience. That's what it shaped for me over the years.
Well, this has been a lot of fun, Bernard. You've mentioned this a couple. Are you the greatest Jewish quarterback in Vanderbilt history or in SEC history?
The quick answer to both is no, but I don't know of another. We did play against Goldberg back when he was at Georgia back in the late 80s. He was just Bill Goldberg back then, but he was a force. We played against him at least one year, I remember. But,
okay,
I'm sure
maybe
there are others.
Yeah, we'll have to do a deep dive into that and build a statue or something, outside the stadium. So, Bernard, this has been a lot of fun. You're a great guy. I really appreciate your time today, and I think it's incredible what you do to keep this Vanderbilt football community together in a really authentic way. I've mentioned this to you before, but I think the fact that you do it independently of the football program or the athletic department is a great thing, and I think it allows players to open up like as they do on your interviews, but keeps people connected to this place in a really authentic way, as I said. And so I think it's incredibly valuable. I'm hoping that our university archives will keep a record of all of your interviews. They'll be so valuable for scholars or authors or students in the future who are, writing about various eras of Vanderbilt football and just what life is like for a student athlete in different eras. So it's a valuable service for your audience today, but also I know it will be, for decades in the future. So last thing, this will be shared obviously outside of your Facebook group, but if you're a former student athlete or a football player at Vandy, who else can join your group? How do they do it? And I know they don't have to pay, but like if you could just provide some basics on the Facebook group and how people can watch these interviews.
Certainly. And first of all, thank you for the kind words today, Andrew. I cherish our friendship and I appreciate the platform that you provide for these kind of conversations. And I'm honored again to have joined you for this conversation. The Facebook group that I created about 4 years ago is just called the Vanderbilt. I think it's called the Vanderbilt Commodores Football Group, and it's on Facebook. It's a closed group. Proudly, we have over 460 people who have joined it. As I said, going back to the 50s all the way up to the current team or guys really become eligible after their eligibility is over. It's not open to fans. It's really not open to parents. It is open to former players, cheerleaders, managers, trainers, coaches, and a few administrators who are long retired, but it is to create the community, just like we're talked about today, to share memories. And Andrew, one of the things that I think is so great, I went back and looked at some statistics. We have over 100 different individuals who contribute, comment, post photos, whatever, every week. And I think that's spectacular. Whether it's pictures from that 1988 season with those awful yellow jerseys, and then the host of comments, because it brings back a flood of memories. But that's where that's what that Facebook group is. And if you find my name, Bernard Nomberg, on YouTube, you can find all of the conversation with Commodores interviews are housed in there. And that's my YouTube channel is a public video, public platform.
Okay, yeah, that's an important distinction. So the Facebook group closed, but the interviews, which we've been talking a lot about today, are public for anybody to watch. That's great. Well, Bernard, thanks again. Look forward to seeing you the next time you're up in Nashville. And everybody check out the Facebook group if you're eligible, and the YouTube page if you're interested. Thanks again. Take care.
Thank you, Andrew.
All right, man, anchor down.